Okay, so a series of emails have come out that were requested under the Freedom of Information Act. And what they show is that at the NIH, Fauci and Francis Collins, who was the head of it, they had a series of conversations with scientists around January 31st or February 1st. There are emails on February 1st summarizing those conversations. And basically what they say is that a group of scientists advised Fauci and Collins that COVID likely came from a lab. How they know? Because it had, hallmark signatures like the furin sites, the same reasons we now believe the virus came from a lab. Okay. But by February 4th, so 3 days later, officials at the NIH, including Fauci, had come to the conclusion that the virus must have been passed zoonotically from an animal like a pangolin. It didn't come from the lab. And furthermore, they were starting to use language like conspiracy theory to discredit the lab leak idea. So that within a few days, they were all in on this sort of so-called zoonotic theory. And they really began a campaign, in the words of Collins, a devastating takedown of scientists who were trying to discuss the lab leak theory. That became the official position.
Why?
Why? Well, okay. So this is where it gets really interesting. Obviously, I can't speculate to motives, but here's what we know. The NIH, Fauci's division, years ago, there was a debate in the scientific community about how we study viruses. Fauci's an epidemiologist. He wants to study them. Makes sense. The debate is over whether you should enhance the viruses as a way to study them, so-called gain-of-function research. Fauci is on the side of engaging in that kind of research. There are other scientists who think it's crazy. They lose. The NIH then makes grants to a group called the EcoHealth Alliance. It's run by a British scientist named Peter Daszak. Okay.
By the way, who doesn't support eco, health, and an alliance?
Yeah, incredible branding.
Yeah, exactly.
And we love puppies.
Yeah, yes.
Angel puppy love.
Yes, exactly. So EcoHealth Alliance, which has neither been good for the ecology, for our health, or alliances.
Yeah, keeping a bad name to alliances everywhere.
Yes. So they then provide funding to the Wuhan Institute of Virology to study bat viruses, where gain-of-function research then occurs. This lab in Wuhan is known to have had leaks in the past. So just from a security choice, not the best recipient of a grant. But that is what happens, okay? And then we know the history from there. It's almost certain that this virus...
What's the element of this story that has to deal with the Lancet and the person that worked for Fauci, and then that person got a grant afterwards? What?
Well, and then just one other thing I want to point out here, so we're clear. This has become a very partisan issue, but the original FOIAs were done by BuzzFeed and the Washington Post. The FOIA releases were done by BuzzFeed and Washington Post. And now you have Rand Paul on the other side of it, who seems like really wacky and obviously conspiracy right wing. So you have this like really weird partisanship that's now been embedded in it.
Okay. Yes.
So, Sachs, can you explain the partisan nature? And then Chamath has a question as well.
I almost want to take Chamath's question first about who is this Daszak guy and what is this Lancet letter. Let me come back to the partisan thing. I'm just going to try and establish the facts before we get into the partisan mess of this thing. So Peter Daszak is the guy who made these grants to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Okay. There is one other interesting fact. When the West wanted to come in and investigate what happened in this lab, China approved one person from the West to come in and conduct the investigation. Guess who that was? Peter Daszak. Okay. He was the only guy the CCP let in to go look at this lab. He then comes out of this, whatever he did, and says, it has to be the zoonotic theory. He endorsed the wet market idea. It cannot be lab leak. That is a conspiracy theory. And then he rounds up a group of scientists to write a letter to the Lancet, which is a respected scientific publication.
Incredibly respected.
Yes, which he signs, in which he basically advocates the zoonotic theory, but he goes further and says there is no way that it could be lab leak, and anyone who says that is a conspiracy theorist. And that has an incredibly chilling effect on the scientific community because no scientist wants to be labeled a kook or a conspiracy theorist.
Or heretical to the Lancet.
Exactly. And this is a tight-knit ecosystem of
insiders.
Insiders and institutions and grants. No scientist wants to lose their funding, right? And then furthermore, big tech starts censoring as disinformation the lab leak theory because they say, well, these officials, look at all the scientists. We have to follow the science, right? So the science, according to this letter from the Lancet, is basically on the side of the zoonotic theory. So you then have downstream censorship of this. So that is who Peter Daszak is. And in this letter in the Lancet, he never disclosed his conflict of interest, which is the fact that he funded this Wuhan Institute of Virology to conduct the type of research that might have led to the leak of the virus. So this guy is hopelessly conflicted and has a reason to want to suppress and cover up a lab leak, and he never disclosed it. And look, so does Fauci. I mean, because Fauci funded Daszak. So imagine when in February of 2020, when the lab leak is coming across the desk of Fauci, does he tell the president, Mr. President, he's at the right hand of the president, Mr. President, we might have funded this thing. We funded Daszak, who funded the Wuhan lab. We collectively, the United States government, might have some responsibility in this. Do you think that conversation ever took place when he was making his recommendations? He was hopelessly conflicted. And if the truth about this had come out, and look, I'm not saying he had any intentional role. I'm not saying he wanted this to happen. I'm not even saying that he knew for sure that Daszak was funding the Wuhan lab. Okay. Let's just give Fauci the benefit of the doubt. But we all know how politics works. If it had come out in February of 2020 that Fauci had funded the guy who funded the Wuhan lab, and that's where the virus likely came from, his career would have been finished. Okay. Finished. We know that as a political reality. And so within days of scientists advising Fauci, hey, this thing probably came from the lab, the NIH is consolidated around the idea that this is a conspiracy theory, and they work to suppress it, and they wage a public campaign. I got to tell you, when I have learned all these facts, I got to tell you what I compare it to. It's almost like when we learned all those revelations about Bill Cosby, that here's this guy on TV for years pretending to be America's dad, and then we find out he's a monster. Fauci has been on TV for years lecturing us about COVID. He's been like America's dad, America's doctor. And lo and behold, we find out that he has a role in this whole thing. And look, I'm not saying...
Well, his intent was not to abuse
of course it wasn't
anybody's intent has been always to help people. So it's a little bit of a gnarly
I'm going to give him the benefit of every doubt here. I'm going to give him the benefit of every doubt. Okay.
You just called him Bill Cosby.
I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt in the sense that he didn't want this to happen. He didn't cause that, but we know for a fact that he funded Daszak, who funded this lab. It's where the virus came from. Come on. We know that. And he covered it up. He engaged in a campaign to suppress the lab leak theory. That is a conflict of interest.
Let's get Friedberg in on the science. What do you think, as a man of science, Friedberg, the Sultan of science, in fact, about these emails and the chances that Fauci essentially was funding gain of research and then attempting to cover it up, which is the accusation?
I don't know if that's a question of science. Look, I mentioned this in the past. Jamie Metzl,
science community,
Jamie Metzl did a podcast interview with Lex Friedman. It's worth listening to. It's a couple hours long if you've got some time to kill. But he does a good job contextualizing these matters and what may have gone on that led ultimately to the lab leak and also the lab leak cover up. I don't know what happened with Fauci and emails. I have not read this stuff. So I have no reason to believe that Fauci is malintentioned in the sense that he has some reason to harm or hurt. I could see that there is a certain degree of nervousness to accuse the biggest foreign government and potential U.S. adversary of causing a global pandemic and not wanting that sort of conflict to arise at a period of time when you really need to take care of your people. And we really need to focus internally as a country on how do we get through this pandemic and making that the priority.
I got to respond to that. I got to respond to that. No. I have to respond to that. I'm not saying that Fauci or anyone involved in that process should have accused China, but that's not what was their decision, and that was not what's debated. They decided to stop the debate altogether. They decided to suppress the debate.
What would you have done in that seat, Sachs? You're sitting in that seat, and the country is potentially facing a pandemic that could wipe out millions of Americans.
Where do you
prioritize? How do you communicate that?
I'll tell you what, if I was sitting at the NIH and I wasn't hopelessly conflicted, I would probably have just said, listen, I don't know what the origin of the virus is. Let that debate continue. I would not have tried to wage a public campaign against the people, against the scientists who were honestly pursuing in good faith where this virus might have come from, so we can learn things, maybe how to avoid something like this from happening again. The people at the NIH should not have engaged in that type of politically minded PR campaign. They just shouldn't. That's not their job as scientists. And then to find out that they have a conflict of interest on top of that, that might be motivating that desire. That is not appropriate.
I think it's really important, Freeberg, you can probably agree with this, that at some point, some journalist should really simplify this for all of us, because it's an incredibly important topic that we need to look at the end of all of this, assuming that Omicron is the end of this chapter, because it's been a horrible chapter for the world. But we do need an accounting of the truth, right? And I think that's really important.
Look, there was an episode many ago when I said, I don't know and I don't care about whether or not the virus came out of China. And again, I was somewhat kind of misstated as the intention of why I said that. The reason I said that, and what I really meant, was that what happened, even if it was a lab leak, what happened was really the tip of the iceberg. The ability to bioengineer pathogenic organisms is becoming ubiquitous. The toolkit to do gain-of-function research, as it's being called in the press, is a very simple toolkit. The ability to engineer organisms that can cause catastrophic harm to the human species is becoming available on the internet and with tools that any of us can buy and use in our garage. And so what I'm more questioning and what I'm more concerned about and what I care more about is, what is our global biodefense strategy? How are we getting ahead of the next wave of this happening?